Welcome to the session Adaptation and Resilience to Climate Change, Lessons from Evaluation. I welcome all of you to this session. And we have exciting panel today, panelists. They are joining today with us. I would like to introduce Geeta Batra, and she will introduce all the other panelists when they come into the floor. Let me introduce Geeta. Dr. Geeta Batra is currently Chief Evaluator and Deputy Director at the Independent Evaluation Office of the Global Environmental Facility. Geeta has 28 years of experience in international development at the World Bank Group, and of which 18 years are in evaluation. She is Senior Manager in Independent Evaluation at the World Bank. Geeta has a PhD in Economics and an MBA. So Geeta is the moderator today and the panel session chair. And also I must thank Jeff Evaluation Office for supporting the conference as well, Adapia and EvalFest 2022 conference. Thank you very much, you, Geeta, and the Jeff Evaluation Office for supporting us and also organizing this panel as well. Geeta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Estella. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all, and welcome to this session on adaptation and resilience to climate change, lessons from evaluations. So we all know, from the damage caused by common extreme events to the threat of rising sea levels, climate change is continuing to affect the world and this region, the Asia-Pacific region in particular, and its plans for growth and development. This session discusses the role that evaluation plays in offering insights into how development interventions are and can address these threats through assisting adaptation and strengthening the resilience of communities and ecosystems. This session will provide recent lessons learned and evaluation findings on climate change adaptation and resilience from several international funds, including the Adaptation Fund, the Global Environment Facility, and the International Fund for Agricultural Development. I would now like to introduce our panel members, who you will see bring a lot of experience and knowledge on this topic. So Nanthi is a lead evaluation officer in the Independent Evaluation of IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. He has over 30 years of development and evaluation experience. As the head of corporate evaluation unit, he has conducted several complex evaluations in IFAD and in UNDP, including a recently completed thematic evaluation of IFAD support to smallholders farmers' adaptation to climate change, which he will mention. In addition to leading global evaluations, he has conducted several country and project evaluations. He received his doctoral degree in engineering at MIT and an MPA from Harvard University. We then have Anna. Anna Vig is a senior evaluation officer at the Jeff Independent Evaluation Office and leads our evaluative work on thematic and cross-cutting topics, including gender mainstreaming and adaptation to climate change. Anna manages the office's work for the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund. Anna has more than 25 years of development and environment experience with the Jeff, UNDP, the World Bank, and several NGOs. Next, Gabriel. Gabriel is an evaluation officer with the Global Environment Facility's Independent Evaluation Office. He leads thematic evaluations of Jeff interventions, including Jeff's work in the artisanal and small-scale gold mining, climate adaptation and resilience, and water security. He is a natural resource management professional specializing in water resource management, forest ecology, and greenhouse gas accounting. He also has a keen interest in geospatial analysis using remote sensing methods, which he integrates into his evaluations. Last but not the least, we have Debbie Menezes, who is the chair of the Technical Evaluation Reference Group of the Adaptation Fund. Debbie has over 25 years of experience in international development, spanning across South and Central Asia, China, Africa, and the UK. Her experience extends to climate change adaptation, urban resilience, regional connectivity, transboundary water, human development, governance, and social inclusion. She has substantial experience in the areas of strategic planning, leadership, and the development of complex high-value programs, monitoring, and evaluation. Debbie has worked as a consultant with the World Bank, the UN, ADB, civil society, and private sector foundations. She was formerly a staff at the UK's Department for International Development. So we've got a very esteemed and experienced panel here, you can see. I will invite the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes each, and then we will leave about 30 to 40 minutes for Q&A. Please feel free to put in your questions on the chat function as well. I just wanted to raise a couple of reminders regarding the definition of terms that we are using in our session today. We're using the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change definition of adaptation, which is the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects, and resilience as the capacity and ability to prepare for, recover from, and adapt to these effects. So that's just a primer because you'll be hearing these terms throughout the conversation. With that, I'm going to hand over to Nanthi to present, drawing on his experience from UNDP as well as his recent work in IFAD. Nanthi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Geeta, for the introduction, and thanks, Appiah, for giving us the space to present our experience. And thank you very much, audience, for sparing your time to listen to us. Good day, good night, everyone. Let me begin this by sharing the screen. I don't know how I can check whether you're able to hear me or whether you're able to see my presentation, but I'll assume if you cannot hear me, I will hear it from somebody here who can tell me that I am not being audible. Let me share the screen and start the presentation. As Geeta mentioned, the presentation here, or the sharing of the experience here, is based on the recent evaluation we completed in IFAD, which covered the entire period where IFAD was active in providing support to farmers, smallholder farmers, adapt to climate change. Starting from 2004, the first effort initiative was undertaken till now. And we considered the entire operations that were that covered the climate response, as well as the entire region, geographic region that was supposed to be that was covered by IFAD. The question there is, why are we worried about climate adaptation? And Geeta already pointed out why we should be worried about it. One of the important things to recognize is the most damage. We know that what damage is being done, but the most brunt of the damage is faced by the most vulnerable, because they are vulnerable, and that is the poor and the marginalized, usually farmers, and the agricultural sector, and the marginalized among them are most affected. Therefore, it was important for us to see how well IFAD and other organizations support and build a climate resilience. One of the challenges that we face is that while climate modeling and to some extent mitigation efforts have in an advanced stage where a lot of evidence and so on is there and a lot of science goes behind that, adaptation is a young field. There is not much evidence because one, it is context specific. Each solution will be dependent on its own context rather than a general model of some sort. So it becomes even more difficult to capture all those knowledge and try to see what works and what doesn't work and provide solutions which are acceptable by farmers at the ground level and also for policy decisions by the government. So in addition to building awareness among the officials and farmers, there is a need also to provide working evidence-based solutions, and that's where evaluations come in. When we evaluated, we noticed two particular challenges which I would like to share with you. One is, okay, we are responding to climate change, but how do we know that it is working? The only way in which we will know it is working is when we find the farmers become more resilient. They are able to withstand the climate shocks and the variations in climate, weather patterns advancing, and so on and so forth, and be able to come up with a response that doesn't affect their income and stability and so on and so forth. Now, how do we know this? The short answer to that is there are various efforts here and there, but there is no universally accepted method or a solution or a way in which we can conceptualize what is climate resilience, how do we measure it, and so on and so forth. And that was there in IFAD as well. And instead, in lieu of the actual changes in resilience, we have indicators like how many hectares were brought under climate smart agriculture, and so forth. These are necessary steps to bring about climate resilience, but they don't tell us enough about whether actually the farmers are benefiting from them or not, or to what extent they are benefiting. So a conceptual framework to understand and assess the effectiveness of the projects in terms of what level of resilience has been built is not there. And the second part that we will also touch upon, which takes us to the second question, is that climate adaptation response has unintended consequences. When agriculture as a whole, it is on the one hand being affected by climate change, on the other hand, it is also causing climate change. It has to be recognized that estimates anywhere upward of 14% of the greenhouse gases are coming from agricultural sector. It could be the commercial agricultural sector and not the smallholders, but the fact of the matter still remains that agriculture contributes, and therefore we'll have to be careful about how we are contributing to these environmental harm and what are the ways in which we can address them and minimize them. So currently the state of thinking is do no harm. That means if you are there, make sure that if you take something away, put something back. So net no harm. But there is also a thinking that is emerging now that given the short time that we have, 8 years for the 2030 agenda, and the IPCC warning that things are changing too fast and catastrophic consequences are already underway, it's being recognized, it is not only enough to do no harm, but we need to restore some of the damage that we have done and improve the ecosystems around us. So how do we do this? Are evaluators equipped for this? Are donors aware of this and willing to fund this? Are governments aware of this and making policy decisions? And what kind of evidence can evaluations bring into this is a challenge that we have. Let me move on to the next slide. So the task in front of us as an evaluation community, as an evaluators, is to build a body of knowledge. Build a body of knowledge that tells us where and how adaptation solutions work, which solutions work. It could be varying from sector to sector. We are interested at this point, from the IFAD vantage point, agriculture, smallholder agriculture. What are the solutions we have? But of course, the same thing applies to any sector that you can think of. The first takeaway that we notice from our evaluation is that we are anthropocentric. And what do we mean by that? So we present a climate adaptation solution and we assess that it is working or not. But when it is working or not, when we assess that part, our observation was many within the development field, including IFAD, may not realize that actually the same climate adaptation solution could harm the environment. We don't build enough assessment technique, technology, methods, and so on and so forth to understand how the agricultural activities that we are pursuing is affecting. So this has two parts. So the first part, what we are saying is, it is no longer good, as we say, good solutions are no longer good enough for us because we are in a crunch time. What do we mean by this? What we mean by this, it is not only enough to build climate resilience, it is not only enough to build economic resilience, but it is also necessary at the same time to build environmental resilience in our climate solutions. So that is the part that we are trying to, when we say that it is good, is not good enough, we mean that you have to find pathways where you are going beyond you are going beyond the economic resilience or the climate resilience, but also focus on solutions that can capture the full resilience of development resilience in the sustainable sense. We know that agriculture is essential for human life. We know without agriculture we can't survive. And we know that agriculture will take something from the environment. And that doesn't mean, so we are not arguing for go to Himalayas and meditate. But what we are saying is if you have taken something from what you are doing, let us say you are drawing water from a closed aquifer, of course, your adaptive solution will involve drip irrigation and making sure that you are not drawing too fast and so on. It is also important for you to build into your solution nature-based solution that will actually replenish the closed aquifer by some way or the other to allow in the long term not the depletion of the aquifer that you are using. So we have to build in solutions that are able to make sure that you are not harming the ecosystems. Now, the important part that we recognized is many would argue that, look, our climate solutions are working. So if you talk, we had a infrastructure project in Bangladesh where we were building climate resilience into highways and market infrastructures and so on. Worked beautifully. There was a cyclone and a flood. These withstood that perfectly. And in fact, so it was successful that the government decided to build in their codes, building codes, climate resilience measures in their infrastructure things. So it was scaling up quite successful and all those things. But we felt that that had also issues with the way that it was dealing with the ecosystem. Markets were built, but markets did not have a waste disposer. You are selling livestock there. There are human beings throughout the day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. What happens to the waste? How do we deal with that particular situation? What kind of considerations do we have that allows us to see the ecosystem effects of those things? So this is what we mean by anthropocentric. We wanted to have a market, we wanted to have the income, and end of story. What happens to the ecosystems is not analyzed sufficiently. So I found that when we were presenting this, this is an obvious statement for Jeff or GCF colleagues or so on. They will say, yeah, of course, it's maladaptation if you don't ensure environmental sustainability. But many development colleagues do not have that understanding. Partly also as a result of it is a coincidence, not a coincidence, it is also a side situation that we are not trained to fully look at the complex ecosystem, what is happening to the biodiversity, what is happening to the soil health, what is happening to the land and water quality, how are we using land, all those things we are not trained to look at. I'm talking about myself. It is not my specialty or expertise to look at environmental considerations until I did this evaluation. And we had a team of experts who are worried about the ecosystem effects. And they taught me what are the different things that the project and interventions have to address, how complex that is, and so on and so forth. So the task is also for us to build the capacity among ourselves. How do we produce this knowledge where it is not just a development, but also not just the economic development, but also a sustainable development that is there. So a final point that I want to say is, now this is all good. This is all looks all good. Okay, we are helping Mother Earth and so on and so forth. But ultimately, the governments have to agree to this. They are worried about poverty reduction. They are worried about saving lives and preventing people from getting hungry. So they treat it as a zero-sum game. If you put money in environment, you are taking money from development. So show us a way. Now you are saying, all what you are saying is good, but show us a way out. Show us a solution that will be a win-win. Show us a solution that will be development. It will build economic resilience and climate resilience and environmental resilience together. And that is part of the reason I think that we have to consciously look for the ecosystem effects in all our solutions. So what we found was, out of the 20 cases that we analyzed, 5 were actually being able to do no harm or even go better, to slightly restore. So those solutions exist, they can be found. It is not to say that they can be found in every single situation, but they can be found or at least we should make an effort to assess whether that is a feasible option or not before conceding it to a zero-sum option. Even in the zero-sum option, then it is up to us to find out solutions of offsets. We call it offsets. So, okay, if you, the aquifer example I gave, if you are going to draw from a closed aquifer, how do you offset the damage that you're doing? Build that into your program. So incidentally, programs and projects have an environmental assessment, comprehensive assessment that is required. Evaluators don't have that. So evaluations do not have an environmental impact assessment as a built-in body. We don't have the expertise, resources, time, all those things kicking. But then we'll have to figure out a way in which, how do we build in this solution also? We can't just say, sorry, we don't have resources, end of story. The challenge for us, all of us, is how do we build in this capacity and build in solutions that we can give to the government and say, here, these are the things that you can do, make your policies accordingly. I'll stop with that. Oh, thank you. Let me stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nanthi, for raising some very important points on evaluating adaptation, the challenges, and the need for evaluators to look more holistically into synergies, trade-offs across environmental areas, as well as looking at the synergies between, or the interconnectedness between human and natural systems. I think that really sets the stage. Now I'd like to get into the second part of our session, which will focus a little bit on results from the evaluations carried out by the Independent Evaluation Office. So Anna will now focus on the findings from two specialized funds that deal on adaptation, the Less Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Geeta, and hello, everyone. As Geeta mentioned, I'm going to talk about two climate adaptation funds, the Least Developed Countries Fund, or we call it LDCF, and the Special Climate Change Fund, also known as the SCCF. There we go. Both the LDCF and the SCCF were established in 2001 under the UNFCCC, or the UN Climate Conference, and both are administered by the GEF. LDCF supports least developed countries to reduce climate change vulnerabilities in priority sectors and ecosystems, and has financed more than 250 projects with $1.7 billion in grants. SCCF supports climate adaptation in all developing countries. It is a smaller fund, having invested $385 million in 90 projects. LDCF and SCCF projects support a wide variety of interventions, including, but not limited to, climate smart agriculture, climate information systems and early warning systems, disaster risk management, coastal zone management, and water resource management. The programming strategy for the LDCF and SCCF emphasizes innovation as the means for reducing vulnerability and increasing resilience. Innovation is defined as applying an approach that is new in a specific context that adds value. And the approach is an improvement in comparison to conventional approaches. It leads to environmental as well as socioeconomic benefits and could have higher risks of failure than conventional approaches. Evaluations have found that both the LDCF and SCCF are seen as originators and supporters of ideas and emerging practices, including the function of reducing the risk of climate change adaptation investments. Both funds have the capacity to pilot, test, and vet emerging initiatives and reduce uncertainties and risks. For example, the SCCF evaluation found that 5 projects in Egypt, El Salvador, Mongolia, Zimbabwe, and a regional project in Cook Islands and Tonga have led to follow-on funding for scaling up and replication of activities and approaches by the Green Climate Fund. Evaluations of the LDCF and SCCF concluded that overall, the funds are performing well. For LDCF, 77% of all completed projects are rated in the satisfactory range for outcomes, while for the SCCF, 79% of projects are rated in the satisfactory range. This is comparable to the performance of the Jeff Trust Fund projects and other organizations in the development field. When it comes to sustainability, SCCF is performing better than the LDCF. 56% of the LDCF and 75% of the SCCF portfolios of completed projects are rated likely to sustain outcomes based on predictions assessing risks at completion. Sustainability is not just a challenge for the LDCF and SCCF, but for the Jeff and other organizations as well. Having said that, there's a continued need for the LDCF and SCCF to put emphasis on factors affecting sustainability during project design and implementation. Here I would also like to mention some of the challenges we have faced in evaluating LDCF and SCCF. Like Nanti mentions, there are many. For LDCF, SCCF, the portfolios are small, with only about 47 LDCF and 33 SCCF completed projects, making it difficult to assess trends and performance. The risks of climate change evolves over time and may increase in the future. While both funds work in several sectors and there are challenges in defining success of adaptation, especially considering the long-term nature of climate change. And related to that, the success of adaptation interventions will not be apparent during the lifetime of the project, making it difficult for end-of-project assessment of outcomes. Looking closer at innovation results, LDCF projects have introduced new technology or adaptation approaches, like the results of a participatory 3D planning model shown in the bottom left-hand photo, first used in Samoa. Developed with the communities, it was used to identify risks and resources for community-level environmental management plans. Another example of innovation in adaptation in a new sector, as seen in the bottom right-hand photo, are new designs for climate-resilient fales, or beach houses for rent, in the tourism sector, also in Samoa. Innovation is a core niche of the SCCF and present in more than 90% of completed projects. SCCF projects frequently introduce innovative approaches to produce adaptation benefits and sustainable financing opportunities. For example, a project in Mindanao introduced a novel weather index-based insurance program for vulnerable farmers facing increasing climate-related hazards. Overall, the SCCF is seen by many as an incubator for riskier technology transfer projects in adaptation that may be suited for subsequent upscaling, financed by others. Given the inherent risks of innovation and technology transfer, the SCCF has the potential to reduce risks in pilot projects that are aimed at experimenting with innovative approaches and technologies. As I mentioned earlier, several projects have led to follow-on Green Climate Fund initiatives. A few lessons on innovation that we have learned from the LDCF and SCCF evaluations include: when new approaches are being piloted, extra time and attention is needed to enable success. An example is the pilot Asian Pacific Climate Technology Network and Finance Center project. Promotion of climate technology investment requires a longer time frame compared to general capacity building. But for timely completion, project sequencing focused on first capacity building, followed by investment, may not be feasible, and that these may need to be carried out simultaneously. Projects need to carefully consider context when piloting new technologies, including beneficiaries, capabilities, and purchasing power. A climate information and early warning system project in Malawi learned that state-of-the-art technology and even standard solutions used in developed countries may not always work in the context of low-income countries, And sustainability is more likely with low-tech solutions with low operating costs. And finally, strong knowledge management and M&E is of particular importance with innovative approaches, so that their viability and value for future interventions is understood. The Coastal Zone project in Mozambique introduced innovative microfinance for livelihoods to reduce vulnerability to climate change. It was called a strong contribution made by the project, but due to the lack of monitoring information on the approach, it was not possible to assess its effectiveness or learn from it for replication. Now looking ahead, in 2019, LDCF, SSCF launched the Challenge Program for Adaptation Innovation that aims to test, validate, and highlight scalable investment approaches, business models, partnerships, and technologies. So far, it has funded 19 projects through 2 rounds of calls for proposals. Beyond promoting innovation, it is the main vehicle for engaging the private sector in the LDCF and SSCF. Although the program is still in relatively early stages, there are some indications that the program has been able to generate some results. For example, it has attracted several new partners to the LDCF and SSCF, including from the private sector. And for one project, a blended finance facility for climate resilience in coffee and cacao value chains in El Salvador, the seed funding from the Challenge Program has helped secure a $5 million credit line, 10 times the seed funding amount. And therefore, there's a lot of optimism for this new program. I will stop there. Thank you very much. And I look forward to our question and answer following our presentations.
Thank you very much, Anna, for highlighting the important role of innovation in adaptation projects. And I'm glad you've stressed on the financing angle, which we aren't covering in depth, but it's clear that climate action entrepreneurs in frontier markets, where we all are from, are rapidly devising marketable solutions to help vulnerable communities actually cope with the consequences of the climate crisis. And they definitely need the capital and the support to de-risk these projects for larger commercial investors, as well as to unlock capital flows at a much larger scale. So the resource requirements are huge, but I think donor countries and others have recognized this and are stepping forward. Switching gears now, adaptation, as Nanti as well as Anna have shown, is important in all environmental projects and not exclusively those that have the objective of adaptation alone. So I now invite Gabriel to present findings from some recent evidence of adaptation across the GEF portfolio, which covers biodiversity, international waters, chemical and waste, land degradation. So it covers a spectrum of focal areas, and Gabriel has just finished a study on looking at adaptation and resilience across this broader portfolio. Over to you, Gabriel.
Okay, thank you so much, Geeta. So yes, my name is Gabriel Sidman. Hello to everyone. And you can see my presentation okay? Okay, I think we are good to go. So I'm going to present on integrating risk, adaptation, and resilience into the GEF. And as Geeta mentioned, I just want to make it clear that this is the findings we'll present here are early findings, as we're in the later stages of this evaluation. Okay, so Geeta mentioned this a little bit at the beginning of the session, but I want to highlight that, when we started this study, we were thinking about how does GEF respond to the effects of climate change in its projects and strategy. And we found that several terms are used for this. One is climate risk screening, also adaptation and resilience. So we wanted to make sure we knew the difference between these terms. And when we talk about climate risk screening in the GEF, we're talking about risks to project outcomes and sustainability. So this is a way of protecting investment that you see banks and other private sector actors use, where we're really worried about when you invest in something, you want to make sure that climate risks in the future are not going to make that investment less viable or impact the sustainability of it. When we talk about adaptation, we're talking about something slightly different, where we're thinking about a project or an activity that recognizes upfront that climate change is going to happen and says, how can we design an intervention that through this intervention, we're helping an ecosystem or a community adapt to climate change. And resilience goes a bit beyond even adaptation, where we think about the system level, and we want to look deeper at the dynamics of the system and say, well, how can we help this system respond to or cope with or bounce back from or even transform to a more resilient state due to a broad range of disturbances. So we go beyond just climate change, and we're talking about, as we've seen in the last few years, other disturbances arise. The pandemic is a perfect example of that. And this term resilience is used in many ways. As you probably all know, it's become quite a buzzword in GEF and outside of GEF. So we want to make sure we understand what we're talking about when we use these terms. So GEF, as Geeta mentioned, is focused on its focal areas: biodiversity, land degradation, even climate change mitigation is a focus of the GEF. But adaptation actually is not a focus of the GEF. But what we found is that adaptation and resilience find their way into GEF's projects, even if they're not the focus. For example, how could you try to discourage land degradation or stop land degradation without considering how climate change will cause prolonged droughts or more intense droughts in most semi-arid areas where land degradation is occurring? And this is true across GEF's portfolio and focal areas. So what we see is that although GEF doesn't design indicators that are specifically focused to measure resilience or adaptation, a lot of its indicators that it uses to measure progress in its focal areas also are measuring pieces of adaptation or components of resilience. For example, if you are trying to build an alternative livelihood around ecotourism to encourage biodiversity protection of a protected area, that also could create an alternative source of income when a shock occurs that impacts agricultural sales. And also we see GEF is really thinking now about integrated programs where it's not just designing a project specifically for biodiversity, for example, but also thinking about how it can integrate its focal areas in one project. And when it does these integrated programs where it breaks down silos of its focal areas, it's really a lot easier to integrate a cross-cutting theme like resilience. So climate risk screening is now mandatory in GEF. They said, okay, well, we need to make sure that climate risks are not impacting any of our projects. So all projects need to do some sort of climate risk screening as of 2019. And what we found is that GEF agencies, these are the implementing bodies of the GEF, mostly United Nations agencies and multilateral banks and large NGOs, environmental NGOs. We found that a lot of the larger agencies already had the capacity to do climate risk screening, especially the multilateral banks that were already thinking about how to protect their investments against climate change. They were in a good position to do this climate risk screening and didn't need very much help. They already had that capacity, but some of the smaller agencies did not. And they really needed support from Jeff and the larger agencies to establish these processes. We also found that climate risk screening is best done as early as possible in the project design process, because if you design your project not thinking about climate change at all, and then you want to retrofit actions in later, that's much more difficult, and the actions that you do will not mesh as well with project activities. And we also saw that projects that were designed before this mandate to do climate risk screening did see negative impacts from natural disasters that could be worsened by climate change in the future. And one project in the Ridge to Reef project in Tonga, that was an integrated watershed management project, we saw that ecotourism infrastructure that the project put into place was destroyed by a cyclone. And the communities and the government were able to respond and think on their feet and reuse a lot of the damaged materials for other purposes. But we did see that the project hadn't thought about such a potential issue when they designed their project. So the scientific and technical advisory panel of Jeff, called the STAP, has started to think about, integrating resilience into Jeff. So how can this be done? And they designed what they call the guidelines for integrating resilience, adaptation, and transformation into sustainable development, RAPTA guidelines. And they piloted this in a project in Ethiopia, where they really did more intense stakeholder engagement, more community engagement, trying to understand the systems that they were going to work in, rather than coming with preconceived notions of what the issues were and how to address them, and also designing for flexibility. So when they piloted this in Ethiopia, what we found is that it was very successful. The project team said that, this is one of the best designed projects they'd ever been a part of. The stakeholder engagement led to them to think outside the box in terms of putting in non-environmental activities into Jeff, which usually only has environmental activities, such as alternative livelihoods, beekeeping, putting into place conflict resolution between herders and agriculturalists, things that they might not have thought of if they hadn't done this stakeholder consultation. And it really improved the ownership of the communities in these activities. But then we asked these project designers, well, are you continuing to use RAPTA in other project designs? And they said no. Well, why not? Because, well, it's labor intensive, it's resource intensive. We got special expertise to come in from the outside and help us put this into place in Ethiopia. And now we won't have that for every project. So it was successful, but a complex process. Nonetheless, when we looked across the portfolio, we found that projects that did integrate resilience in design were more likely to have satisfactory outcomes. And the higher levels of integration actually had a more significant correlation with satisfactory outcomes. So although it can be complex to integrate resilience, really thinking about those broad system level issues and trying to address them, even if they're socioeconomic and not particularly environmental for the Jeff, it is worthwhile to try to incorporate resilience into design. And these are some of the ways that we recommend Jeff can do that in the future. And I will stop there and turn it back over to you, Geeta.
Thanks very much, Gabriel. I think your work has really highlighted the importance of incorporating, planning for resilience and adaptation at the design stage, as well as right through implementation, right? And whether it's risk screening or anything, I think the key is also to keep it simple. Like RAPTA was viewed as pretty complicated, even though it was good. So something that can be mainstreamed, Thank you very much again. And now we'll hear from Debbie, Chair of the Thematic Group for Evaluation at the Adaptation Fund, on how a fund that is primarily focused on adaptation is looking to address some of the challenges in evaluating the adaptation projects. And you've just heard about all these different challenges. So over to you, Debbie, for all the solutions.
Hello, everyone. Hi, I hope you can see my slides. Geeta, could you just nod? Yes, excellent. Okay. Well, thank you, Geeta, for that very kind introduction and for inviting me to be a panel member. It's really good to be here this evening. I'm in Delhi, and so good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who's joining today. So I'd just like to start by providing a very short background on the Adaptation Fund to help set the scene. The Adaptation Fund, slides are not moving. There we go. So the fund is an innovative financing mechanism that's been set up by the Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Its goal is to reduce vulnerability and to increase adaptive capacity to respond to the adverse impacts of climate change. And it does this by financing concrete adaptation projects and programs in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, and that they need to be parties to the Kyoto Protocol and more recently to the Paris Agreement. The fund has a 5-year medium-term strategy and action plan, and it's driven through 3 pillars of action, innovation, and knowledge sharing. But there are 3 unique aspects of this adaptation fund in the broader climate finance as a landscape that I'd like to flag. Firstly, the fund exclusively focuses on financing adaptation, and it supports concrete adaptation projects that are aimed at reducing vulnerability and increasing the adaptive capacity of human and natural systems to respond to the impacts of climate change. Secondly, it supports a very country-driven ownership approach, including through a direct access implementation modality, which means that implementing entities can directly access finance and manage all aspects from design and implementation to monitoring and evaluation. And this approach is unique because it's intended to build national and local adaptive capacities. And the idea is that you would then create successful models that can be replicated and scaled up by other sources of finance, other sources of climate finance. And then thirdly, as you will see from the 2 result areas that I've highlighted above, there's an emphasis on people as well as the environment. And we've heard other speakers talk about this approach as well. And this is reflected in the fund's policies on gender and social and environmental policies as well. And one significant outcome of COP26 is there's been an increasing recognition of the need for adaptation and resilience. And you can see that the fund has received pledges which are quite substantial, and new funders have come on board for adaptation. Just a very quick introduction to the AFTERG, which is the technical. So we are an independent evaluation function for the fund. Now we are fairly new. We've only been operational since July of 2019. We're independent. We report directly to the Adaptation Fund Board. And we have 3 functions, which includes commissioning evaluations, providing advice and guidance, and then keeping oversight of quality of fund requirements and practice on the evaluations. And this is quite a unique model because, we're a small group of people. It's a chair plus 4 independent experts who serve as members, the manager of the board of the secretariat as ex officio member, and a small secretariat. And so since we've only been in operation since July, which is less than July 2019, less than 3 years, I'm just going to talk through some early reflections which are emerging from our work. And this is really around 3 things. One is framing. How do you frame an evaluation approach when you're a new group? How do you deal with some new concepts, and how do you develop appropriate methods to assess adaptation and resilience in the context of sustainability? And then the importance of values in how you take forward our work. So as we started out, we needed to develop our work program. So we needed to understand the niche role of the fund, the diversity of the portfolio across different developing country contexts, and the operating model. So our starting point was we must ensure that we have a fit-for-purpose monitoring, evaluation, learning framework that grasps the urgency of climate change and is responsive to context. And some early work that was done by a range of colleagues who are listed below identified a few challenges through some foundational studies. So we know that climate change is a wicked problem, and we need to develop our MEL approaches to kind of recognize that. And so we realize that MEL needs to go beyond a linear model of evaluations and something that is better suited to the complexity of climate change and that can take account of risks and uncertainty. A second challenge is around building a MEL approach that can also look at the complex and dynamic interactions across social, economic, and environmental domains across different contexts, across different sectors. And there's no common methodology that we can apply to programming across countries, across political jurisdictions, across things that might be transboundary in nature, and that might involve different groups of stakeholders. A third set of challenges was around the need to strengthen data management and use. There were issues around the definition of what constitutes success and what is the approach to determining whether it's been successful and what point it's been successful. So some of these challenges were around the time lag between the intervention being delivered and the result, which might not even be verifiable for a number of years because of climate change uncertainty, the lack of baselines, uncertainty as to whether the results or the benefits can withstand the climate impact in the future. So, and so we also thought about needing to take into account data that is broader than just generated by results frameworks. So climate data generated by other activities, for instance. A fourth challenge is around ensuring genuine and substantive participation of all interest groups within MEL processes. And this requires an appreciation of the role of stakeholders, not just as beneficiaries, but also as co-contributors to the MEL process. And this can help to build ownership, ensure that people are active rather than passive participants, but also yield important data and learning that might not necessarily emerge from a sort of external top-down driven approach. And then the fifth challenge is needing to move beyond accountability and strengthening MEL support for adaptive management and for learning, real-time learning, especially when you're working in a rapidly changing and unfamiliar context, to understand how the system is responding to shocks and stresses, to support adaptive management and learning on a continuous basis. And there's also a need for feedback loops between the stages of the intervention. So a second reflection is around new concepts and approaches for sustainability and resilience. And we're again following the same IPCC definitions on both adaptation and resilience. And so this is it's usual practice for organizations to have final or terminal evaluations once a project ends. And there are few examples of this happening, say 3 to 5 years after the project has ended. So the Adaptation Fund board asked us, the actor, to develop some sort of exposed evidence on what happens after a project has ended 3 to 5 years down the line. Ultimately, this was intended to provide learning on climate change actions and accountability of results financed by the fund. So drawing from the literature, we had, this work is still ongoing actually. So just some of the dilemmas that I've drawn from the work that the consultants are doing and from the broader literature in M&E as they relate to sustainability and resilience. This is not meant to be a comprehensive list, but just an indication of some of the things. So firstly, understanding whether on sustainability, we need to understand whether a project's outcomes and impacts are durable in the long term, 3 to 5 years, say, after funding has ended, what factors might be at play. But there are challenges with this in terms of missing or unclear theories of change, no baseline data, no outcome data, difficulty in tracing contribution, etc. So there's also some conceptual ambiguity on how reducing vulnerability and increasing resilience relate to one another in evaluating the sustainability of project outcomes and impacts. So a project may, for instance, take measures to reduce vulnerability, but this doesn't mean that it's going to be sustainable or climate resilient in the future. It could be sustainable without necessarily being climate resilient, or vice versa, it could be climate resilience without necessarily being sustainable. So these are the sorts of issues. Then there are also lots of definitional issues and framing issues around sustainability and resilience, which are not the same thing. They're related, but they're not the same thing. Resilience definitions are also very broad. Is it about retaining functions after the shock has happened? Or is it about adapting, or is it transforming? Is it about the ability of a system to reorganize itself? So many resilience frameworks across organizations, and there was a scan done of these, consider quite a spectrum of approaches, which again covered the ability to anticipate, to absorb, to adapt, to transform, etc. Resilience is also subjective, as we've heard before, context specific, and may therefore not be replicable across different contexts or sectors. In terms of framing it also, we need to think about the time factor. What is resilient at design may not be relevant after years of completion. Should we be also looking at the dynamism of resilience over time in the context of climate disturbances versus, capturing a measure of resilience at a particular moment in time? Also, there's issues about the nexus. I won't, dwell too much on this, but generally in development programming, the incentives are very much to focus on human systems. For instance, numbers of people affected by an intervention in terms of their livelihoods or assets or well-being. But there's limited attention to results frameworks for natural systems, and also even less to the nexus between the two. And so these are some of the issues that have been surfacing in debates and in the literature. And then also resilience is not about a single intervention dealing with risks at the individual or the community level, but requires a more sort of systems level thinking, which involves multiple actors and levels. There are also issues around the methodology. There's many different resilience frameworks that exist across organizations and sectors, but there's no generic indicators or methods to quantify these. And there's sort of challenges to look at the scale of, the different scales of the project interventions, different measures, etc. So that's kind of what our initial scoping of this work was. And so what we're doing now here is we're developing some methodology on ex-post evaluation. And I must credit Yendra Sikkan and Meg Spearman for their work on this, which is looking at two things. Looking at how sustainable are project outcomes over time, since it's been completed in 3 to 5 years' time, and how climate resilience are those sustained project outcomes. And what they've done is they've developed some tools. So the ex-post tool is actually a decision tree, which to decide on the different types of methods based on the availability and the quality of data. If there is data, then the tool suggests that you use certain methodologies. If there's no data or limited data, that there's another set of methodologies. And for resilience as well, it provides an analytical tool to assess climate resilience. And it looks at 5 components of resilience, which are related to climate disturbances, human and natural systems and the nexus, the characteristics of resilience in the outcomes, the means and actions supporting outcomes, and then a new typology that the consultants have introduced, which is about resistance, resilience, and transformation. There's some other work that I won't dwell too much on this, but essentially what we've already done, and this is available on the website, is a midterm review of the fund's medium-term strategy, just to kind of think of the strategic approach. And then at the moment, we're also revising the evaluation, the approach of the fund's evaluation framework, and we're updating that, and we will be presenting that to the board shortly. And my last slide really is, in terms of ways of working, we also emphasize a values-based approach. We believe it's important, not just in terms of what you do, but how you do it. And this frames our approach and behavior and how we take forward evaluations, how we work in a participatory way with stakeholders to co-create, to co-generate, for co-ownership and co-learning. And this is really important in terms of adopting a transparent and inclusive process. But it also links back to the point on resilience, because if stakeholders are going to act on information, then I think it's really important to have that information as part of learning. So let me stop there. And thank you very much, Geeta, and others presenters, co-panelists. It's been a pleasure to be part of this panel. If I were to just reflect on one key message, I think the urgency of climate change is upon us, and we cannot wait for the future, for evaluation results to happen in the longer term. So we need to ensure that there's feedback loops, there are processes that we're really thinking about generating evaluative evidence in a timely way, in a way that it can be taken up and used by all stakeholders, really, decision makers, people who are implementing, people who are benefiting. So let me just stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Debbie. Clearly, the group you chair is looking into very pragmatic approaches to measuring outcomes, and more importantly, a key aspect is sustainability, right? Donors are not just interested in outcomes, but the sustainability of outcomes. And this is something we're paying a lot of attention to in the GEF as well. So you've heard from 4 very good, experienced speakers today. And I think, based on the questions we received in advance, as well as some of the questions in the chat, there were challenges raised, as well as what should evaluators be, taking into consideration as a result. And I have a few takeaways from this before we get into the Q&A session. One is we definitely need consensus on terminology, and there were some questions on terminology. Recognizing that these interventions are complex, happening over a variety of scales. So how do evaluators account for that? And you definitely need a more systems-based approach. So you're taking into account possible intended as well as the unintended consequences. And there was a question and an issue raised on that, which is really important. Clearly, the need to move beyond indicators. Indicators don't say it all. And that's why we're all in the evaluation business, because it says a lot more than just a metric. Learning, and Debbie just pointed about this MEL approach, learning. And the point is not just to learn from successes, right? So what we've embarked on is we're actually doing an undertaking to look from learning from projects that I don't like to call it failures, because they probably had a lot of challenges while implementing. But let's put it as those that didn't achieve what they sought out to achieve for a variety of reasons. And those could actually give evaluators a lot more information than just learning from positive projects. And finally, measuring sustainability, sustainability of interventions. The one challenge that measuring adaptation raises is, how do you come up with a counterfactual, and therefore would impact evaluations really work? So I'm going to start with, based on the questions received, as well as some of the thoughts that have come up in the chat function. We have 2 rounds of issues. One is really about how does one account for this and look for these issues that have been pointed out through the course of this presentation at the project level. So Nanti, you mentioned challenges for evaluation at the project level. How is IFAD trying to address these challenges in measurement at the project level? Over to you, Nanti.
Thank you. First of all, there are issues that we deal with that have to recognize that we have. Let me take a step back. As Gabriel pointed out, when we talk about ecosystems effects, there we are looking at a system level resilience. When we look at smallholders and their economic resilience and climate resilience, we could be looking at from anywhere from farm level to community level and so on and so forth. So we are looking at 2 different levels, scales, and that is where the problem starts. So first we should be mindful of that we are looking at different scales. Ecosystem, one scale, the resilience of climate and development and so on comes at different scales. Second point, we asked the question, if I'd asked the question, resilience to what and resilience of whom? So these 2 questions have to be asked. So it could be shocks or it could be stresses, slow onset or rapid climatic catastrophic events. And it will be at the farm level or at the community level, for whom question. So one of the ways in which IFAD is still developing this now, and one of the things that we recognized early on is that there are multiple ways of doing resilience. Different people do it different ways. So there has to be some kind of a consistency among actors to agree on, because we all have to measure the same resilience at some point or other. We'll be working in a similar area, same area, whatnot. So the challenge is to have a similar idea about resilience. So one of the things that World Bank, IFAD tried out, which seems to be working in Ethiopia, is to look at a systematic approach, which similar to what Debbie was mentioning. We look at the absorptive capacity. Are we building the capacity for farmers to absorb the shocks? The adaptive capacity is the capacity to be prepared for to hazardous events and so on and so forth. And then the transformative capacity, which is sometimes the stress is too much and you have to move on. You have to move from one field to the other. You have to give up your livestock and move on to crop technology. So the three different types of capacities will be the way in which we systematically track how things change for the smallholders. There was a question in the chat box asking whether resilience is a capacity or an outcome. And our answer is resilience is the measure of capacity. That means how capacity manifests itself. It could be in the way of income getting variabilities, income getting stabilized. It could be a number of things depending on the local context. And as Debbie correctly pointed out, you will have different resilience to different stresses. It'll be a flood, you'll have one type of resilience. If it is a high rising temperature, it will be another. So it is a very complex thing. It is still an evolving thing, and it's a young thing, and it can't be worked out by one agency alone. It has to be consistently, evaluation field as a think through this collectively, not only evaluation field, development field as a think through it collectively and arrive at measures and so on and so forth that is consistent across and easy to measure, so that we don't talk across each other as we evaluate and find solutions. Over.
Thanks, Nanti. Something I think not just for practitioners to keep in mind, but also for evaluators, right? The different kind of capacities that we should be looking at as we're assessing projects. Related to this point, Anna, your presentation also highlighted some of the challenges in evaluating the LDCF and SECF adaptation projects. Based on your experience, what can project implementers and evaluators do differently, to address these challenges? Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Geeta. Those are really difficult questions to answer and big challenges. And I think for LDCF and SSCF, one of the main challenges is just the maturity of the portfolio. And also, as time goes on, every 4 years, they update their implementation strategy. There's still things in there that are consistent, but then there are also new elements that we need to take into account each time we look at the funds in detail, which we do about every 4 years. But more generally speaking, when it comes to project implementers, I think like for any development intervention, they can make use of a good theory of change that breaks down and articulates what the process of adaptation involves. And in recent years, there has been more work and research on developing theories of change for climate change adaptation. I mean, it's still a relatively new area, but there is a lot of work that has been done that implementers can draw on. Implementers can also invest more in M&E and adopt indicators that reflect the process of adaptation at different scales and provide contextual richness. When it comes to the GEF, as Gabe mentioned earlier, there's a lot of interesting work being done by the GEF Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel. And a few years ago, they issued a paper on this issue called Strengthening Monitoring and Evaluation of Climate Change Adaptation. I don't see that it has really been picked up by the GEF and LDCF, SSCF, but it is there for implementers and practitioners to use. When it comes to evaluators, I think it's even more tricky. They can also use existing theories of change or develop them retroactively, especially for project level evaluations. I think it's more challenging if you're doing a program evaluation and looking at a wide range of projects, especially when they're in many different sectors. And also to help with the evolving climate risk, evaluators can use available climate data, such as rainfall and temperature for a geographical area, to see if conditions have become worse or how they have changed during project implementation. Such trends can help in assessing the success of interventions. And then another thing which Debbie talked about is post-completion evaluations. They can be used to assess outcomes and impacts 4 or 5 years after the end of the project. And the Jeff Independent Evaluation Office has worked on developing a tool for post-completion evaluations. And for the most recent LDCF program evaluation, we did test the tool in 2 different countries. And it is a tool that we have not been able to use so much recently because of travel restrictions from COVID, but it is something that the office will continue developing. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. And especially for highlighting the importance of a theory of change. So as evaluators, we often rely on, project practitioners, make sure you have a theory of change. But I think it's as important for evaluators, whether you're doing a project level or a thematic evaluation, to start off with a theory of change, which also then makes it transparent for people or the evaluand that what is the framework against which you're holding them accountable in evaluation, right? It also depicts that evaluators have a clear thinking about what the theory of change is based on the literature, empirical evidence, or even project evidence. So thanks for raising that. So Gabriel, you highlighted a few instances of people not being prepared during implementation. They were planning for the longer term, but then not during the project itself. What do you think some project methods might be that projects can use for planning for addressing disturbances that may arise during implementation? Over to you, Gabe.
Yes, thanks, Geeta, for that question. And it's a very good question. As we see with the pandemic, and even some of the examples I gave during my presentation, it's often very difficult to know exactly what the next disturbance will be, or what the severity of a disturbance will be. And so when you're designing a project and you have limited resources, and you have to pick a place to implement, how do how is it possible that you can accurately predict this disturbance and how to respond to it? And I think one thing we see from literature is flexibility in design, and really, as much as possible, try to address some of the systems level issues that will allow ecosystems or societies to respond no matter what the disturbance is. And the good news is that a lot of those issues that are at the systems level are the same, depend no matter what the disturbance is. If people have diversified incomes, they're better able to respond to any sort of disturbance. So, I think one thing is, especially financial systems where you're talking about insurance schemes, some sort of financial buffer is very important, or some sort of some agencies call it a crisis modifier, where you're building flexibility into your design and what you can do with resources. So if a crisis occurs while you're implementing, you can quickly pivot with how you're spending your resources. And I think, dealing with climate data, as Anna was mentioning, is important, and getting help interpreting that, because, I think a lot of times you get project designers who try to interpret global circulation models, or they look at literature, and one article is telling them that rainfall is going down, and the other is saying, well, it might go up. And how do you deal with uncertainty in projections? I think you need support with that. You need expertise, and easier said than done, but flexibility is important when you're designing a project. So I'll stop there, Geeta.
Thanks, Gabriel. And it's important for multilateral funds then to allow for such flexibility, right? Whether it's in terms of adjusting projects or the timing, etc. So Debbie, you mentioned that reducing vulnerability may not lead to sustainability or increased resilience. So I was wondering, what do you think that practitioners should be thinking about in project design, or through implementation, to actually increase sustainability and resilience, in the longer term? Over to you, Debbie.
Thank you, Geeta. That's a good question, the $1 million question. Yeah, so I think there's a number of things here. I think firstly, we need to understand some of the terminologies of what we're trying to do when we're designing projects. So for instance, you need to understand who the vulnerable are. I think even IPCC technical documents note that there's no standard definition of vulnerability. So it's very context specific. Try and understand what are the factors that drive vulnerability. It might be useful to also look at the context, what's available in terms of vulnerability assessments or national data, national plans, stakeholder mapping. I think stakeholder mapping is a really important one as well. The other sorts of issues which other panelists have also referred to is trying to think about some of the direct and indirect effects of climate change, as well as other risks. And I think Gabriel's also mentioned this, particularly in terms of things like pollution or invasive species or other things that might be affecting it from an environmental perspective, as well as the other external factors like migration, distress migration, or conflict, which is another big one, or COVID, because there's a risk of multiplier effect of risks, where risks actually compound, risks from other areas compound. So you can't just look at vulnerability, I think, through one lens. You have to sort of consider it in a more holistic way. I think another thing to think about earlier on in planning is exit strategies. And very few projects actually think about exit strategies until they've reached the very end. And so, what are the factors that might affect sustainability within the project context, like financial or these are the general ones, financial, institutional factors, social, environmental, etc., as well as changes in things like policies, external markets, etc. Many projects tend to leave this too late or miss having one entirely. And then I think, we've said this already, but adopting a systems approach that looks at the interactions across the different levels, as well as across different stakeholders, looks at the dynamics at play, not just the internal intervention logic, but you need to kind of take a more comprehensive. And I'd just like to leave you with one example of where things can, an example from a project visit where I visited one of these landscapes which was suffering from drought. So as an alternative livelihood strategy, along came some other funders and funded, gave these people goats as an alternative source of livelihoods because they couldn't grow their crops. And so they found after a while that this already sparse landscape, the shrubs were disappearing and nobody could figure out what, until somebody followed the goats and found out that the goats were eating it. So, you can see how one set of interventions can actually, not relate with another. And therefore, we need to really kind of think about our intervention, not just in silo, but think about, the broader context within which that project or intervention is placed. Thank you, Geeta. Back to you.
Thanks, Debbie. You raised the very important point of taking into account, possible trade-offs that can arise from various interventions, right? So I think we probably have time for a rapid fire round of, 10 minutes of a second. And I think no session on evaluation would be complete unless we kind of brought it together to say, so what does this mean for governments or for policymakers? So Nanti, what do you think that evaluations could do to assist governments, to pursue sustainable climate adaptation response? Over to you, Nanti.
Thank you, Geeta. Very good question. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm not a policy expert, but I know I know how governments think. Correct. After evaluating so many years, the first thing they want to bottom line they will ask us is, okay, you are suggesting this. What is it? What is the bottom line here? Are we going to reduce poverty? Are we going to do anything with this? So tell us what. So this is what I mentioned earlier as well. We need to be able to provide them with concrete solutions. We need to be able to say, this is not a pie in the sky, win-win solutions. Non-zero-sum games are possible. First, check them in your. This is what we found in your country. Give them examples of solutions that have worked, which is win-win, which means all three resiliences are together. Climate resilience, economic resilience, environmental resilience were achieved together in their own electorate or whatever it is, and that can be an evidence base for them to start. And then the second part that we have to advocate is, okay, that is not, we grant, that is not always possible. You can't get that all the time. So then how do we deal with this quote unquote zero-sum game business? So then we tell them that, okay, you have to do this, you are doing agriculture. What is the offsets that you can offer? What you can do as a subsidy to promote offsets, because offsets, the farmers are not going to do it by themselves, and we have to show then the benefits, long-term benefits, and convince them that in the overall economic returns of whatever that you're doing will outweigh the immediate cost. So bottom line, both parts have to be simultaneously working, which is we not only worry about the development, economic development, but we have to worry about the climate resilience, and we have to worry about the economic resilience, and we have to worry about the zero-sum games as well as the non-zero-sum games, and provide evidence-based solutions to them that appeals to them. Over.
Thanks, Nanti. And I hope we have representatives from the governments listening. So I think we have time for one last question. Debbie, very quickly in a couple minutes, what do you think some of the, learning, the MEL approaches you mentioned would be useful for, policymakers such that they can, who work across a spectrum of complexities, contexts, systems? What would you say to them?
I think I would advocate, for a theory-based changed approach. I think that's something that's come up from the conversations as well. But I think it's really important to generate. So if you're looking at policymakers, we've got all this wealth of evidence, let's just say, from my evaluations. I think we need to translate it in a way that they can understand it, that is practical, that takes account of the practicalities of resources as well. And also, I think, takes account of, inclusion. And that's something that that's also very important to kind of frame that to policymakers so that they understand the benefits of what the evaluations can do. Often evaluation tends to be coming too late. Decisions are already made, including resource decisions. And I think we need more iterative loops and to get that information in a presentable way to policymakers so that they can take action. Thank you, Geeta.
Thanks, Debbie. So Gabriel, what do you think, funds that are focused on more than one aspect, not just adaptation, but covering a spectrum of environmental issues, what would be your advice to them in light of the fact that, there are other more focused adaptation funds?
Yes, thanks for that question, Geeta. I think the Jeff is a good example of that, where it's not focused on adaptation, and you do have entities like what Anna was discussing, the LDCF and the SECF, and even the GCF that are focused on adaptation. So I think the Jeff, what we heard from stakeholders is that because the Jeff doesn't focus on adaptation and resilience, it has a unique opportunity when it does mainstream it across all of its focal areas to really build capacity among practitioners and project staff, agencies, governments, civil society that are focused on perhaps an issue like chemical pollution. It allows them to better understand adaptation and resilience and the connections it has with their topic. So in that sense, Jeff and other funds that are not focused on adaptation have a unique opportunity to build capacity and integrate adaptation themes and bring them to areas that might not have learned about these issues in any other ways, or in their traditional learning and subject area expertise.
Thanks, Gabriel. So we're coming on the hour or our 90-minute session. I have one last question for Anna, because I think we've got to end with an M&E question. So Anna, what do you think the role has been of monitoring and evaluation in influencing the outcomes of these adaptation projects based on the evidence?
Thank you, Geeta. Yes, M&E plays a vital role in adaptation projects. Evaluation of the LDCF found that weak M&E was a factor for hindering sustainability of outcomes, while strong M&E was a contributing factor to sustainability. Timely implementation of midterm evaluation recommendations can also improve implementation and the final outcomes and results of a project. And then for projects that are focused on innovation, M&E is particularly important as part of the testing new technologies and approaches. M&E data will provide the evidence of effectiveness which is necessary for possible scale-up and replication.
Thanks so much. So in closing, first, I'd like to thank the organizers of HAPIA. I'd like to thank the participants, all of you who have listened to us, as well as the panelists. What we've learned and taken away is adaptation interventions. They're diverse, they cut across sectors, they cut across scales. They're known barriers and their constraints to their delivery. A number of agencies represented on this panel are furthering evaluation frameworks and methods for systematic assessments, taking into account the multi-scaled nature of this challenge. We've heard about the importance of taking into account the nexus between human and natural systems, moving beyond indicators, learning from successes as well as from challenges, and first of all, coming up with a consensus on the terminology so that we all work from a common framework. Thank you all for your participation, for your listening, and we hope you've enjoyed this session today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Geeta and panelists. From our side also, we must thank you all, especially Geeta for excellent moderation and chairing the panel, and panelists for the very rich discussion and very rich presentations, and also the participation, all the participants actively participated by posting questions and also participating in the discussion. I also thank our production team and conference organizing team for supporting this. And with that note, we end the session here, and also invite all the participants to join the conference tomorrow and day after as well. I'm sure that you have received the session details as well as Zoom links to join the sessions. So see you tomorrow and day after. And good evening, good afternoon, good day, wherever you are from. Thank you very much.